My hands are trembling as I push open the heavy oak doors of St. Catherine's. The familiar creak echoes through the empty sanctuary, a sound that once meant coming home. Now it feels like stepping into a tomb. I haven't been inside a church in 23 years. Not since I fled this town at 18 with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of secrets I couldn't name. But here I am at 72, drawn back by something I can't quite explain. Maybe it's because Thomas has been dead for 2 decades now, and I thought the ghosts would finally be quiet. The afternoon light filters through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the worn wooden pews. Everything is smaller than I remember, but the smell is exactly the same: old hymnals, furniture polish, and that lingering sweetness of communion wine. My legs feel unsteady as I make my way down the center aisle, past the spot where I used to sit with my parents every Sunday morning, past the altar where I once believed God listened to every prayer. I slide into a pew halfway down, the same place I used to sneak glances at the choir loft during boring sermons. My purse feels heavy in my lap, weighted down by the manila envelope I've been carrying for weeks. Inside are photographs I haven't looked at in decades, pictures my mother saved before she died, pictures I couldn't bear to throw away but couldn't stand to keep visible. The silence in here is absolute. It's the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I close my eyes and try to remember why I came here today. Maybe I thought I could finally make peace with this place. Maybe I thought I could walk in here and feel nothing at all. But then I hear it. Voices drifting down from somewhere above, young voices blending in harmony. The youth choir must be practicing upstairs in the old rehearsal room. My chest tightens as the melody becomes clearer, more distinct. They're singing Amazing Grace, the same arrangement we used to perform every Easter. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. The blood drains from my face. My hands start shaking so violently that the envelope slips from my fingers, spilling its contents across the wooden pew. Black and white photographs scatter like fallen leaves, images from another lifetime, another version of myself I've spent 50 years trying to forget. There I am at 12, gap-toothed and grinning in my white choir robe, standing in the front row with the other sopranos. There's another one of me at 13, receiving some kind of music award, my face glowing with pride. And there, in every single photograph, is Thomas Whitmore. My godfather. My choir director. The man who taught me to love music and then made me hate it. That saved a wretch like me. His voice seems to whisper along with the children upstairs, even though he's been in the ground for 20 years. I can hear him so clearly it's as if he's sitting right beside me, his breath warm against my ear the way it used to be during those private lessons. The way it was when he'd place his hands on my ribs to teach me proper breathing technique. The way it was when he'd hum hymns while his fingers wandered places they should never have gone. I pick up one of the photographs with shaking hands. It's from my confirmation ceremony. I'm 14, standing between my parents and Thomas. We all look so happy, so blessed. I remember that day. I remember how proud my mother was, how she kept telling everyone that Thomas was like family, that he'd taken such special interest in my musical education. She has the voice of an angel, he'd told the congregation that morning, his hand resting on my shoulder. God has given her a rare gift. Everyone smiled and nodded and said how lucky I was to have such a devoted mentor. No one saw the way his thumb traced small circles on my collarbone. No one heard what he whispered in my ear when he hugged me goodbye. I once was lost, but now am found. The hymn continues upstairs, innocent voices carrying a melody that used to lift my spirit but now makes me feel like I'm drowning. I want to run. I want to gather up these photographs and flee the way I did all those years ago. But my legs won't move. I'm frozen in this pew, trapped between the child I was and the woman I became, listening to the echoes of songs that were turned into weapons. He's been dead for 20 years, but I can still hear his voice. I can still feel his presence in every note, every harmony, every sacred song that was supposed to bring me closer to God but instead taught me that some sins hide behind the most beautiful music. The photographs blur as tears I didn't know I was crying fall onto the glossy surfaces. After all this time, after all the therapy and distance and carefully constructed silence, I'm still that frightened little girl who couldn't understand why something that felt so wrong was happening in such a holy place. But I'm also something else now. I'm a survivor. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to stop running from the hymns. I was 12 when Thomas first noticed my voice. Really noticed it, in a way that would change everything. It happened during Sunday service in the spring of 1963. Mrs. Henderson, our usual choir director, had called in sick with the flu, and Thomas had stepped in to lead us through the morning hymns. We were singing, "How Great Thou Art," when something shifted in the sanctuary. I felt it before I understood it, the way the other voices seemed to fade into the background, the way the congregation grew quieter, more attentive. Thomas stopped conducting mid-verse. His hands froze in the air, and his eyes found mine across the choir loft. For a moment, the only sound in that vast space was my voice, soaring clear and pure above the organ's gentle accompaniment. I didn't know then that I was supposed to be embarrassed, supposed to blend in. I just sang the way singing felt natural to me, the way it felt like breathing. "Margaret Chen," he said after the service, approaching our family as we gathered our things. That was extraordinary. My parents beamed like they'd just been told their daughter had been chosen by God himself. Which, in a way, I suppose they thought she had been. "She's always been musical," my mother said, smoothing down my hair with her gloved hand. "Been humming since she could walk." Thomas knelt down to my eye level, his kind face serious and intent. "Margaret, would you like to learn to use that gift properly? To really understand what God has given you?" I nodded eagerly. I'd been singing in the children's choir since I was 8, but Thomas directed the adult choir, the real choir. The one that performed solos and special arrangements, the one that made people close their eyes and sway during the music. "I'd like to give her private lessons," he told my parents. "Voice training, music theory, proper technique. She has rare potential." My father shook Thomas's hand firmly. "We'd be honored. You've done so much for this church, for all the young people here." And it was true. Thomas Whitmore was beloved at St. Catherine's. He'd been our choir director for 15 years, had transformed our little church's music program into something the whole town was proud of. He organized concerts, brought in guest musicians from the city, and had a gift for drawing out the best in every singer. Parents fought to get their children into his youth programs. More than that, he was family to us. My godfather, chosen by my parents when I was baptized as an infant. He'd been at every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every important moment of my young life. When I scraped my knee learning to ride a bike, Thomas was there with band-aids and gentle words. When I had nightmares about monsters under the bed, he'd sit with me and sing lullabies until I fell back asleep. Uncle Thomas, I called him, like all the children did. He wasn't really anyone's uncle, but he belonged to all of us in that special way that some adults do, the ones who choose to love other people's children as their own. The lesson started the following Tuesday. Thomas had converted a small room behind the sanctuary into his private studio, complete with an upright piano, music stands, and shelves lined with hymnals and sheet music. The walls were covered with photographs of past choirs, awards from music competitions, and inspirational quotes about the power of sacred music. "Music is prayer made audible," he told me during that first lesson, his fingers dancing across the piano keys as he played scales for me to match. "When we sing for God, we become instruments of His grace." I absorbed every word like gospel. The way he talked about music made it seem holy, important, like I was being entrusted with something precious and rare. He taught me about breath control, about posture, about the way different vowel sounds could shape a melody. He introduced me to composers I'd never heard of, pieces that were far more complex than anything we sang during regular church services. "You have a gift, Margaret," he'd say, his eyes shining with what I thought was paternal pride. "A voice like yours comes along once in a generation. We have a responsibility to nurture it, to help it grow." Those early lessons were magical. I felt special, chosen, like I was part of something bigger than myself. Thomas would play recordings of famous sopranos, pointing out techniques I could learn, styles I could emulate. He talked about scholarships to music schools, about the possibility of a career in sacred music, about all the doors that might open for a young woman with my particular talents. My parents were thrilled. Every Tuesday evening, they'd ask about my lesson, hanging on every word as I described what I'd learned. My mother started bragging to her friends about my special training with Thomas. My father, usually quiet about such things, would beam when people complimented my solos during Sunday service. "Thomas sees something remarkable in our Margaret," he'd say, puffing up with pride. "Says she might have a real future in music." I lived for those lessons. They became the highlight of my week, the thing I thought about during boring school days and tedious chores. Thomas made me feel important, talented, worthy of attention and care. He made me believe that my voice was a gift from God, and that He was the guardian of that gift. I had no way of knowing then that gifts can be poisoned. That guardians can become predators. That the most beautiful songs can hide the darkest secrets. I was 12, and I trusted Him completely. It started with breathing. I was 13, had been taking lessons with Thomas for almost a year. My voice had grown stronger, more controlled, and I could hit notes that made the congregation turn in their seats during Sunday service. Thomas said I was ready for more advanced techniques, ready to learn what the real professionals knew about using the body as an instrument. "Breathing is everything, Margaret," he said during what should have been an ordinary Tuesday lesson. "Most people think singing comes from the throat, but true power comes from here." He placed his hand flat against his own diaphragm, demonstrating. "Feel how it expands when I breathe in, how it contracts when I breathe out." I nodded, trying to mimic what he showed me. I'd been working on breath control for months, practicing the exercises he'd taught me every day after school. "Good, but you're still breathing too shallow. Here, let me show you properly." Before I could process what was happening, his hands were on me. One palm pressed against my chest, just below my collarbone. The other rested on my back, between my shoulder blades. "Now breathe in slowly," he said, his voice taking on that patient, instructional tone I'd grown to love. "Feel how your ribcage should expand." Something inside me went very still. His hands felt different than they ever had before, not like the casual touches of a Godfather or the professional guidance of a teacher. They felt deliberate, lingering. But he was talking about music, about technique, about helping me become the singer he knew I could be. "I can feel you tensing up," he said, his hands remaining firmly in place. "You need to relax, Margaret. Trust me. This is how all the great singers learn." I tried to breathe the way he wanted, tried to focus on the lesson. But my skin felt hot under his palms, and something in my stomach twisted in a way I didn't understand. I was 13, old enough to know something felt wrong, but too young to have words for what that wrongness was. "Better," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Feel how much fuller your sound can be when you use your whole body." He had me sing scales while his hands stayed pressed against me, monitoring my breathing, he said. Making sure I was doing it right. The lesson seemed to last forever, his touch burning through my thin blouse, making me hyper-aware of my own body in ways that felt shameful and confusing. When it was over, when he finally stepped back and smiled that familiar, kind smile, I felt dizzy with relief. "Excellent progress today," he said, making notes in the little book where he tracked my development. "You're really starting to understand how to use your instrument properly." I gathered my sheet music with shaking hands, desperate to get out of that small room, desperate for fresh air and space to think. But Thomas wasn't finished. "Margaret," he said as I reached for the door handle. What we worked on today, the breathing techniques, they're quite advanced. Other students, other choir members, they might not understand the level of instruction you're receiving. I turned back to look at him, confused. What I mean is, he continued, his voice gentle but serious, this kind of specialized training is between us. Your parents trust me to develop your gift in the best way possible, and sometimes that means using methods that might seem unusual to people who don't understand professional vocal instruction. He moved closer, kneeling down so we were eye to eye the way he used to when I was small and scared. You trust me, don't you, Margaret? You know I only want what's best for your voice, for your future. I nodded, because of course I trusted him. He was Uncle Thomas. He was family. He'd been part of my life since before I could remember, had never been anything but kind and encouraging and proud of me. Good girl, he said, and something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. This is our special work together. The way we're developing your gift is something very few students get to experience. It's between us, our secret about how serious musicians really train. I walked home that day feeling like something had shifted, like the ground under my feet wasn't quite as solid as it had been that morning. I couldn't shake the memory of his hands on me, couldn't stop thinking about the way his voice had changed when he called me, good girl. But when my mother asked about my lesson over dinner, I found myself saying what I always said, it was wonderful. Thomas says I'm making excellent progress. Because that was true, wasn't it? I was getting better. My voice was stronger, more controlled. And Thomas was my godfather, my teacher, the man who believed in my gift when no one else even knew I had one. The wrongness I felt had to be my own fault, my own immaturity, my own inability to understand what real musical training required. He'd said it was between us, our special secret about professional technique. And I was a good girl. I knew how to keep secrets. Even from myself. By the time I turned 14, the lessons had become something else entirely. Something I both craved and dreaded with equal intensity. Thomas had a way of making everything sound holy, even when my skin crawled at his touch. He'd quote scripture while his hands wandered during our breathing exercises. He'd hum hymns while teaching me what he called advanced performance techniques that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with control. God has blessed you with exceptional gifts, Margaret, he'd whisper during those private sessions, his voice taking on the reverent tone he used during Sunday prayers. But gifts come with responsibilities. With sacrifices. I was old enough now to understand that what happened in that small room behind the sanctuary was wrong. But Thomas had spent months weaving a web of confusion around me, mixing sacred language with secular shame until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. This is how devoted artists learn, he'd say when I tensed under his touch. This is the price of excellence, of truly serving God with your voice. He'd started giving me solo opportunities that the other choir members envied. Special performances during evening services, featured parts in our Christmas and Easter concerts. Each solo came with additional private rehearsals, more time alone in that suffocating room where the walls seemed to press closer every week. The other children wouldn't understand this level of dedication, he'd remind me after each session, his hands lingering where they shouldn't while he straightened my choir robe. They don't have your calling, your special relationship with the divine. Special relationship. The words made me sick, but I found myself clinging to them too. Because if this was special, if this was chosen, then maybe it wasn't the terrible thing my body told me it was. Maybe it was just another sacrifice I had to make for my music, like the hours of practice or the strict diet he'd put me on to maintain optimal vocal condition. The isolation was the worst part. Thomas had a gift for making sure I was always just slightly separate from the other choir members. He'd schedule my lessons during their group rehearsals, assign me different music that required individual coaching, create opportunities that kept me apart from girls my own age who might have asked uncomfortable questions. Excellence requires solitude, he'd explain when I mentioned feeling lonely. The greatest artists have always had to walk a path others couldn't follow. At home, my parents glowed with pride at every special performance, every solo opportunity. They'd invite relatives to church just to hear me sing, would beam when other congregation members praised my voice. My mother started talking about music conservatories, about the scholarship opportunities Thomas had mentioned. "You're so blessed to have his guidance," she'd say, polishing my choir medals and arranging them carefully on my dresser. "Some children never find their true calling. You found yours and have the perfect teacher to nurture it." Perfect teacher. The phrase echoed in my head during those sessions when Thomas's hands explored boundaries that had nothing to do with vocal instruction. When he'd press himself against me while supposedly demonstrating proper posture. When he'd whisper hymns in my ear while doing things that made me want to disappear entirely. "Be still and know that I am God," he'd murmur, quoting Psalms while I stood frozen, trapped between his body and the piano. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." My understanding told me to run. My understanding told me to scream. But Thomas had spent 2 years teaching me not to trust my own understanding, teaching me that my discomfort was selfishness, that my resistance was a failure of faith. "This is our covenant, Margaret," he'd say, using words that sounded biblical and important. "Our sacred bond. The way we prepare your voice for God's service." I started having nightmares. Not about monsters under the bed like when I was little, but about being trapped in that practice room forever, about my voice disappearing entirely, about standing in front of the congregation and being unable to make any sound at all. My grades began to slip. Teachers commented on my distraction, my tendency to stare out windows during class. My parents attributed it to the demands of my musical training, to the intensity of working with someone of Thomas's caliber. "Artists are different," my father would say when report cards came home marked with B's and C's instead of my usual A's. "They live in a different world than the rest of us." A different world. That was exactly what Thomas had created, a world where wrong was right, where pain was privilege, where my silence was service to God. A world where I was simultaneously the most blessed and most cursed child in our congregation. 16 came and went in a blur of performances and private lessons, of sacred music turned into something profane, of hymns that would never again sound innocent to my ears. I could hit high notes that made people weep, could control my vibrato with professional precision, could make my voice soar through the sanctuary like something divine. But inside that beautiful sound was a girl who was slowly disappearing, note by note, lesson by lesson, prayer by prayer. Thomas called it my transformation into a true artist. I was beginning to understand it was actually my destruction. I was 17 when I finally tried to tell someone. The words had been building inside me for years, pressing against my throat like a song that demanded to be sung. But when I finally opened my mouth, no one wanted to hear the melody. It happened on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd come home from another lesson with Thomas, my clothes disheveled, my hands still shaking from what he'd done in the name of advanced vocal coaching. My mother was in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner, the same hymns I'd been hearing in that practice room just an hour before. The sound made my stomach lurch. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you about something." She looked up from the potatoes she was peeling, her face bright with the kind of maternal attention I'd been craving for months. "Of course, sweetheart. How was your lesson today? Thomas mentioned you're preparing something special for the Christmas concert." The irony wasn't lost on me. Of course he'd already spoken to her. Thomas had a way of staying one step ahead, of making sure his version of events was always the first one people heard. That's what I wanted to talk about." I sat down at the kitchen table, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. "The lessons. They make me feel uncomfortable." My mother's hands stilled on the potato. "Uncomfortable how?" I searched for words that wouldn't sound crazy, wouldn't make her think I was making things up or being dramatic. How could I explain that the man she trusted like a brother, the man who'd baptized me and sung me lullabies, was doing things that made me want to crawl out of my own skin? He touches me, I said finally, the words falling like stones into the quiet kitchen. During the breathing exercises. He puts his hands, places they shouldn't go. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My mother set down the peeler and turned to face me fully, her expression shifting from concern to something I couldn't quite read. "Margaret," she said slowly, "Thomas is your godfather. He's been part of our family since before you were born. He's dedicating hours of his time to developing your gift, asking nothing in return." "But Mom, are you sure you're not misunderstanding his instruction methods?" She moved closer, her voice taking on that patient tone adults use when they think children are being silly. "Advanced vocal training involves understanding how the body works. Thomas studied at conservatories, he knows techniques that might seem unusual to someone who doesn't understand professional music education." Each word felt like a slap. She was using the same language Thomas used, the same explanations he'd given me for why his hands needed to be places that made me feel sick and ashamed. "He's like family, Margaret. More than family. When you were little and had those terrible nightmares, who sat with you? When you needed someone to believe in your talent, who was there? Thomas has never been anything but loving and supportive." Loving. The word twisted in my chest like a knife. "I know he cares about me," I said, tears starting to blur my vision. "But the way he touches me, it doesn't feel like teaching. It feels wrong." My mother sank into the chair across from me, her face softening with what I thought might be understanding. For a moment, I dared to hope she might listen, might believe me, might find a way to make it stop. Instead, she reached across the table and took my hands in hers. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I think you're just growing up, becoming aware of your body in new ways. It's natural to feel awkward sometimes, especially with all the changes happening at your age." The hope crumbled inside me like stale bread. "Thomas has sacrificed so much for your development," she continued. "Do you know he's turned down offers from bigger churches, better positions, just so he could continue working with you? Do you know how many strings he's pulled to get you auditions for youth competitions?" She was right, of course. Thomas had done all those things. He'd opened doors for me that would never have opened otherwise, had invested time and energy in my future that went far beyond what any normal teacher would do. "Maybe," my mother said, standing up and smoothing down her apron, "you should focus on being grateful instead of looking for problems that don't exist." The conversation was over. I could see it in the way she turned back to her potatoes, in the set of her shoulders, in the firm line of her mouth. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mother's words echoing in my ears. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was being ungrateful. Maybe the sick feeling in my stomach was just adolescent confusion, just my own immaturity making me misinterpret kindness as something darker. 2 weeks later, I tried to quit choir entirely. I told my parents I wanted to focus more on my regular studies, maybe explore other interests. The reaction was swift and devastating. Thomas himself came to our house that evening, his face grave with concern. He sat in our living room, speaking to my parents in low, worried tones about artistic temperament and the challenges gifted young people face. He mentioned the music scholarships he'd been working to secure for me, the opportunities that would disappear if I abandoned my training now. "Margaret's at a crucial point in her development," he told them, his voice heavy with disappointment. "If she stops now, all the work we've done together will be wasted. All her potential, thrown away." My parents looked at me like I'd announced I wanted to burn down the church. "You're not quitting," my father said, his tone brooking no argument. "Not when you're so close to achieving something remarkable." Thomas smiled at me across the room, and in that smile I saw my future stretching out like a prison sentence. More lessons. More private sessions. More hands where they didn't belong and hymns whispered in my ear while my world crumbled. "I knew you'd come to your senses," he said. Good girls always do. Part 6, The Breaking Point. Senior year was supposed to be my triumph. Thomas had arranged for me to audition at 3 prestigious music conservatories, had written glowing recommendation letters that painted me as a prodigy destined for greatness. The whole congregation buzzed with excitement about our Margaret and her bright future in sacred music. But by 18, I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. The lessons had become something I could barely endure. Thomas's behavior had escalated beyond the boundaries of even his twisted version of instruction. He no longer bothered with the pretense of breathing exercises or vocal coaching when he put his hands on me. The hymns he whispered had become darker, more possessive. "You are mine," he'd breathe against my ear while I stood frozen at the piano. "Body and soul, you belong to me." I'd started having panic attacks during regular choir practice. The sight of him raising his hands to conduct would make my chest tighten, would make the sanctuary walls seem to close in around me. I'd excuse myself to the bathroom and spend long minutes gripping the sink, trying to remember how to breathe without his hands on my ribs. The Sunday it all shattered was Easter morning, 1969. The sanctuary was packed with families in their finest clothes, children squirming in uncomfortable shoes, the air thick with the scent of lilies and new perfume. I was supposed to sing, "Christ the Lord is risen today," as a solo, the same hymn I'd been performing since I was 14. I took my place at the front of the choir loft, my white robe freshly pressed, my hands clasped in front of me the way Thomas had taught me. Below in the congregation, my parents sat in their usual pew, their faces glowing with pride. This was their moment too, the culmination of years of sacrifice and support, proof that their daughter was truly blessed. Thomas raised his hands, and the organ began the familiar introduction. I opened my mouth to sing the first line, "Christ the Lord is risen today, Alleluia." But instead of my voice soaring clear and strong through the sanctuary, what came out was a strangled gasp. The words died in my throat as if someone had wrapped invisible hands around my neck. The congregation waited, expectant faces turned up toward me, while I stood there mute and trembling. Thomas kept conducting, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The organ continued its gentle accompaniment, but I couldn't make a sound. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people, I had never felt more alone. The silence stretched on, becoming uncomfortable, then embarrassing. I saw my mother's face in the third pew, confusion replacing pride as she realized something was terribly wrong. My father frowned, leaning forward as if proximity might help him understand why his daughter was standing speechless in front of the entire church. And then, like a dam bursting, everything inside me broke at once. I ran. Not walked, not excused myself politely. I gathered up my choir robe and fled down the center aisle while the entire congregation watched in stunned silence. Behind me, I could hear Thomas trying to salvage the moment, leading the choir in the hymn without me, his voice booming confidently as if nothing unusual had happened. But I was already pushing through the heavy oak doors, gasping for air that didn't smell like incense and guilt, my white robe billowing behind me like the wings of some wounded bird. I didn't stop running until I reached the park 6 blocks away, where I collapsed on a bench and sobbed until my throat was raw. The Easter service continued without me, the congregation probably told I'd taken suddenly ill, my parents making apologies and excuses they didn't understand themselves. That night, they found me in my bedroom, still in my choir robe, staring at the acceptance letter from Westminster Choir College that had arrived the week before. A full scholarship, Thomas's greatest gift to me, and the chain that would bind me to him for 4 more years. "Margaret, what happened today?" my mother asked, sitting carefully on the edge of my bed. "Everyone's so worried about you." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone who had chosen Thomas over me so many times that it had become habit. Someone who would continue choosing him no matter what I said, no matter how I begged, no matter how much evidence I laid at her feet. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered. "Can't do what, sweetheart?" But I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because the truth was too big for that room, too poisonous for the air we breathed. Instead, I took the acceptance letter in my shaking hands and tore it in half. Then in half again. And again. The pieces fell like snow around my feet, fragments of the future Thomas had planned for me, the future that would have kept me within his reach forever. My mother gasped, reaching for the torn pieces as if they could be reassembled, as if the scholarship could be unbroken. "Margaret, what have you done? This was your dream." "No," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "It was his dream. It was never mine." That night, I applied to colleges across the country. State schools with accounting programs, business departments, anything that had nothing to do with music or churches or men who used God's name to justify the unjustifiable. I was going to disappear. I was going to become someone Thomas Whitmore had never touched, never shaped, never owned. I was going to find a way to survive. The University of Oregon was as far from home as I could get without crossing an ocean. I chose it because it was 3,000 miles away from Thomas Whitmore and because no one there had ever heard me sing. In the accounting program, I was just another freshman with a head for numbers and no particular story to tell. I thought distance would be enough. I thought if I could just get far enough away, change my major, change my entire life, the memories would fade like old photographs left too long in sunlight. But trauma, I learned, travels light. It packs itself into the smallest spaces of your mind and follows you wherever you go. The nightmares started during my second week of classes. I'd wake up gasping, my dorm room spinning around me, the phantom sound of hymns echoing in my ears. My roommate, a cheerful girl from Portland named Susan, would find me sitting up in bed at 3 a.m, staring at nothing. "Bad dreams?" she'd ask, her voice heavy with sleep and concern. I'd nod and lie back down, but sleep wouldn't come again. Instead, I'd lie there listening to Susan's even breathing and trying to convince myself that I was safe, that Thomas was 2,000 miles away, that he couldn't reach me here. But safety, I discovered, isn't just about physical distance. It's about being able to trust your own body, your own instincts, your own worth. And Thomas had taken all of that from me, piece by piece, lesson by lesson, until I didn't know who I was without his voice telling me. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity I'd once brought to music. Numbers were clean, logical, predictable. They didn't lie or manipulate or whisper false promises in your ear. A balance sheet either added up or it didn't. There was no gray area, no room for interpretation or twisted theology. My professors praised my dedication, my precision, my ability to spot discrepancies that others missed. What they didn't see was that I was using accounting the way some people use alcohol, as a way to numb the parts of myself that hurt too much to feel. Dating was impossible. The few times I tried, the moment a boy got too close, the moment hands started wandering or voices dropped to intimate whispers, I'd freeze up completely. My body would remember things my mind was trying to forget, and I'd make excuses and flee before anything could happen. There was David, a sweet engineering student who walked me to class and brought me coffee during finals week. He kissed me once outside the library, a gentle, innocent kiss that should have been lovely. Instead, I had a panic attack so severe that campus security had to be called. David never spoke to me again. There was Michael, who took me to see a movie and held my hand in the dark theater. When he moved closer during a romantic scene, his breath warm against my ear, I bolted from my seat and ran to the bathroom, where I threw up until my stomach was empty and my throat burned. What's wrong with me? I'd ask my reflection in those bathroom mirrors, my face pale and drawn, my eyes hollow with exhaustion. But I knew what was wrong. I just couldn't say it out loud, couldn't give it words that would make it real. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in accounting and a job offer from a respected firm in Seattle. My parents came to the ceremony, beaming with pride that was different from the musical pride of my childhood, more subdued, less ecstatic, but genuine nonetheless. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," my mother said, hugging me carefully, as if I might break. "You've built such a successful life for yourself. Successful. The word rang hollow in my chest. I had a career, an apartment, a bank account with enough money to feel secure. But I also had insomnia that left me exhausted most days, anxiety that made simple social interactions feel like navigating a minefield, and a complete inability to let anyone get close enough to really know me. I married David Nakamura when I was 28, partly because he was kind and patient, but mostly because I thought marriage might fix whatever was broken inside me. He was a fellow accountant, methodical and gentle, who didn't push when I flinched at unexpected touches or woke up screaming from dreams I couldn't explain. "It's just stress from work," I'd tell him when he asked about the nightmares, the panic attacks, the way I sometimes seemed to disappear into myself for hours at a time. "I've always been high-strung." He believed me because he wanted to, because it was easier than confronting the possibility that his wife was carrying secrets too heavy for their quiet life together. We lasted 3 years, 3 years of me trying desperately to be normal, to be the wife he deserved, to pretend that intimacy didn't terrify me. The divorce was amicable, civilized, heartbreaking in its politeness. David never understood why I couldn't let him in, and I couldn't explain without destroying the careful walls I'd built around the truth. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said the day I moved out of our suburban house with its white picket fence and carefully tended garden. "I hope you find peace." Peace. As if it were something you could locate on a map, something you could drive to and claim as your own. I spent the next 15 years building a fortress of routine and solitude. Work, home, sleep, repeat. No music, no churches, no relationships that required me to be vulnerable. I was successful by every external measure: partner at the firm, beautiful condo, financial security that would have amazed my younger self. But inside that fortress, I was slowly disappearing, becoming smaller and quieter and more afraid with each passing year. Thomas had been dead for 5 years by then, but his voice still lived in my head, whispering that I was broken, that I deserved what had happened, that no one would ever love me if they knew the truth. I was hollow, echoing with hymns I couldn't silence and shame I couldn't shake. And I thought that was how I'd spend the rest of my life, safe in my isolation, successful in my emptiness, surviving but never truly living. I had no idea that everything was about to change. I was 52, living in the quiet rhythm of my Seattle life, when the phone call came that shattered 34 years of carefully constructed silence. It was a Tuesday evening in March. I remember because I'd just finished reviewing quarterly reports and was settling into my evening routine: herbal tea, the news, then bed by 10. The phone rang just as I was reaching for the remote, and I almost didn't answer. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and our conversations had grown increasingly strained over the years, full of careful politeness and subjects we both avoided. "Margaret, dear, I have wonderful news," she said, her voice bright with an enthusiasm I hadn't heard in years. "The church is planning the most beautiful celebration for Thomas's retirement. Can you believe he's finally stepping down after 47 years of service?" The mug slipped from my hands, crashing to the hardwood floor and sending hot tea splashing across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. The room was spinning, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint as my mother's voice continued, distant and distorted as if coming through water. "They're calling it a lifetime of sacred music and service. The whole community is involved, former choir members coming from across the country, special performances, even the mayor is supposed to speak. It's going to be in the newspaper and everything." 47 years. Thomas had continued his ministry for 34 years after I fled. How many other girls had sat in that practice room? How many other voices had he silenced while whispering hymns in their ears? "Margaret? Are you there?" I forced myself to breathe, to speak, to pretend that my world hadn't just tilted off its axis. "Yes, I'm here. I know you and Thomas had some difficulties toward the end of your time with him," my mother continued, choosing her words carefully. "But surely you can appreciate what he's meant to this community. The lives he's touched, the young people he's inspired. The lives he's touched." The phrase made bile rise in my throat. They're asking for former students to send letters, to share memories of how he influenced their musical development. I thought you might want to contribute something. After all, you were one of his most gifted pupils. Most gifted. Most vulnerable. Most thoroughly destroyed. I can't, I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like broken glass. Can't what, dear? I can't. I won't be part of any celebration for Thomas Whitmore. The silence stretched between us, 34 years of unspoken truths hanging in the air like smoke. When my mother spoke again, her voice had cooled considerably. Margaret, I know you've chosen to distance yourself from your musical past, and that's your right. But Thomas is 83 years old. This might be his last chance to receive the recognition he deserves. Surely you could put aside whatever teenage resentments. Teenage resentments? The words exploded out of me before I could stop them. Is that what you think this is about? Well, what else would it be? You've always been so dramatic about. I hung up. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely press the end call button. I stood in my pristine living room, surrounded by the trappings of my successful life, and felt like that terrified 18-year-old again, invisible and voiceless while the adults around me decided what version of the truth they were willing to accept. The panic attack hit like a freight train. My chest seized, my vision blurred, and suddenly I couldn't get enough air no matter how hard I tried to breathe. I slid down the wall onto the tea-soaked floor, my careful composure dissolving into the raw terror I'd been holding at bay for decades. Through the roaring in my ears, I could hear my mother's words echoing, * a lifetime of sacred music and service. The lives he's touched. Recognition he deserves, *. Recognition. Thomas Whitmore was going to be honored, praised, celebrated. He was going to stand in front of that community and accept their gratitude while I sat 3,000 miles away, still too afraid to speak the truth about what he'd done to me. Still too ashamed to say the words that might save other girls from the same fate. But what if I wasn't the only one? What if, somewhere out there, other women were hearing this news and feeling the same sick dread? What if we were all sitting in our separate silences, each believing we were alone? The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it meant the scope of Thomas's damage was beyond what I'd imagined. Comforting because it meant I might not be as alone as I'd believed. When the panic attack finally subsided, when I could breathe again without feeling like I was drowning, I did something I hadn't done in 34 years, I started researching Thomas Whitmore. Not the beloved choir director, not the pillar of the community, but the predator who had hidden behind sacred music and holy words. I searched online for his name, for St. Catherine's Church, for any hint that someone else might have spoken up over the years. What I found made my blood run cold. Article after article praising his dedication to young singers. Photos of him with choir after choir, always surrounded by children, always with that same kind smile I remembered so well. Awards and recognitions spanning decades. And comments from former students, glowing testimonials about his mentorship, his special attention, his life-changing influence. But buried deeper, in forums and message boards, I found other things. Casual mentions of his intensive coaching methods. Jokes about his hands-on approach to teaching. Comments that made my skin crawl because they sounded so much like the language people had used to dismiss my own discomfort all those years ago. And then, on a survivor support forum, I found a post that stopped my heart. Looking for other survivors of church abuse in small-town Washington. Choir director, 1960s, 70s. Can't use his name yet, too scared, but he's still there. Still teaching. Still touching young girls and calling it God's work. The post was anonymous, dated just 3 months ago. 3 months before the retirement celebration was announced. I wasn't alone. And Thomas Whitmore's 47-year reign was finally going to end. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to respond to that anonymous forum post. 3 weeks of staring at my computer screen, typing and deleting messages, my finger hovering over the send button while my heart hammered against my ribs. What if it was a trap? What if Thomas had somehow discovered the forums and was baiting survivors into revealing themselves? What if the person on the other side of that post wasn't real, wasn't like me, wasn't someone who would understand? But what if she was? The message I finally sent was pathetically brief. I think we might have had the same choir director. St. Catherine's, 1960s. Can we talk? Her response came within hours, and with it, a name that would become my lifeline, Sarah. Margaret. Oh my God, is it really you? I remember you from church. I was 3 years behind you in school, but I watched you sing every Sunday. I thought you were so lucky to get private lessons with him. Lucky. The word hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it all the bitter irony of our shared experience. Sarah Martinez, I remembered her now, a small girl with dark braids who used to sit in the front pew with her grandmother. She'd joined the children's choir right around the time I'd started my advanced training with Thomas. We arranged to meet through encrypted video chat, both of us too paranoid for phone calls, too scattered for face-to-face meetings. When her pixelated image appeared on my screen, I saw my own damage reflected back at me, the carefully controlled expression, the way she held herself like someone perpetually braced for impact, the eyes that had seen too much too young. I can't believe we're actually doing this, she said, her voice shaky but determined. I've been carrying this alone for 30 years. 31 for me, I replied. I ran away to college and never looked back. I thought if I just disappeared, it would stop mattering. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. I tried that too. Got married at 19 to the first boy who asked, moved to California, changed my name. But it followed me everywhere. The nightmares, the panic attacks, the way I'd freeze up whenever someone touched me unexpectedly. We talked for hours that first night, trading pieces of our stories like survivors sharing rations. She confirmed what I'd suspected, that I wasn't Thomas's only victim during those years. There had been other girls, other special students, who received private lessons and learned to keep secrets. There was a girl named Jennifer Walsh, Sarah said, her image flickering as her internet connection wavered. She was in my grade. Started lessons with him right after you left for college. She only lasted 6 months before her family moved away suddenly. Her parents said it was her father's job, but I always wondered. Jennifer. The name meant nothing to me, but Sarah's description sent chills down my spine. Another 13-year-old with a promising voice and trusting parents. Another child fed into Thomas's carefully constructed system of abuse. And Lisa Chen, no relation to you, different family, she came after Jennifer. She stuck it out longer, maybe 2 years. But she quit choir entirely her junior year, stopped going to church. Her parents were furious, said she'd become rebellious and ungrateful. The pattern was becoming clear. Girls with talent, girls from devout families who trusted Thomas implicitly, girls who suddenly withdrew or acted out or found reasons to leave. How many of us had there been? How many had suffered in silence while the community praised Thomas for his dedication to young people? Over the following weeks, Sarah and I conducted our own investigation. We scoured social media, high school alumni pages, church newsletters, looking for names and faces from our shared past. We found Jennifer Walsh living in Phoenix, working as a paralegal and raising 2 daughters she'd never let join any kind of choir. We found Lisa Chen in Portland, a successful doctor who'd never married and donated generously to childhood trauma organizations. The conversations were brutal. Each woman we contacted had to relive her worst memories, had to admit things she'd spent decades trying to forget. But there was also something powerful in the sharing, something that began to dissolve the shame that had isolated us for so long. I thought I was crazy, Jennifer confessed during our first group video call. My parents kept saying I was making things up, that I was jealous of the other kids' success. I started to believe them. He made me believe I wanted it, Lisa added, her usually composed doctor's demeanor cracking. That I was special, chosen. The guilt almost destroyed me. We were 4 women now, scattered across the country, bonded by shared trauma and a growing determination to break the silence that had protected Thomas for decades. We'd each built successful lives despite what he'd done to us, but we'd all paid a price: failed relationships, chronic anxiety, an inability to trust or be truly intimate with another person. He's getting that celebration in 6 months, Sarah said during one of our late-night calls. 47 years of service, they're calling it. 47 years of being praised for destroying children. What if we told them? Jennifer asked quietly. What if we all came forward together? The question hung in the digital air between us, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. We'd spent our entire adult lives running from this truth, hiding from it, trying to outrun the damage it had done. But together, we were stronger than we'd ever been alone. They won't believe us, Lisa said, voicing what we all feared. He's a pillar of the community. We're just troublemakers trying to destroy a good man's legacy. Maybe, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. But maybe they will. And maybe there are others, girls who came after us, women who are still too afraid to speak up. Maybe if we go first, we can give them permission to tell their truth too. It was Sarah who said what we were all thinking: we can't let him have that celebration. We can't let him stand up there and accept their gratitude for ruining our lives. One by one, we agreed. 4 women who'd spent decades in silence, finally ready to find our voices. The war against Thomas Whitmore was about to begin. The letter we sent to St. Catherine's board of directors was 5 pages long and signed by all 4 of us. We'd spent weeks crafting it, each word chosen carefully, each accusation backed by specific memories that still made our hands shake to write. We detailed Thomas's pattern of abuse, his methods of grooming and manipulation, the way he'd used religious authority to silence us. The response came 3 weeks later, a single paragraph of legal boilerplate expressing the church's concern for our alleged experiences, while noting that such serious accusations would require thorough investigation through proper channels. Proper channels. As if there were a handbook for reporting abuse that happened decades ago, as if there were protocols designed to handle the systematic destruction of children's lives. The investigation, when it finally began, was a masterclass in institutional self-preservation. The church hired an outside firm, supposedly independent, though we quickly learned they specialized in crisis management for religious organizations. They interviewed us separately, their questions designed not to uncover truth but to poke holes in our stories. Can you provide physical evidence of these alleged incidents? They asked Jennifer during her 3-hour video deposition. It was 30 years ago, she replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. What kind of evidence did you expect me to preserve from when I was 13? And you're certain these memories haven't been influenced by therapy or media coverage of similar cases? The implication was clear: we were either liars or victims of false memory syndrome, our trauma dismissed as either malicious fabrication or psychological delusion. They questioned every detail, every timeline, every witness who might corroborate our accounts. The fact that we'd all kept our abuse secret for decades was turned against us. If it had really happened, they suggested, surely we would have told someone at the time. These are very serious allegations against a man who has devoted his life to serving God and this community, the lead investigator told us during a joint conference call. We have a responsibility to Mr. Whitmore to ensure any claims against him are thoroughly substantiated. Responsibility to Thomas. Not to the children he'd harmed, not to the women whose lives he'd damaged, but to the man who'd spent 47 years hiding behind sacred music and holy words. The investigation dragged on for months while Thomas continued his duties, continued working with young singers, continued receiving praise from a community that couldn't imagine their beloved choir director as anything other than the gentle mentor they thought they knew. Finally, the report was released, internally, with carefully worded findings that acknowledged our sincere belief in our experiences while concluding there was insufficient evidence to substantiate the specific allegations made. The recommendation was for Thomas to receive additional supervision and for the church to review its youth protection policies. Additional supervision. As if a watchful eye could somehow undo decades of trauma or prevent future abuse by a man who perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. The church's official response was even more insulting. Rather than face the public scandal of a formal investigation, they quietly negotiated Thomas's early retirement, 6 months before the celebration that had started this whole process. He would step down with full honors, his pension intact, his reputation carefully preserved. Mr. Whitmore has decided it's time to focus on his health and family, the church announcement read. We are grateful for his many years of dedicated service and look forward to celebrating his remarkable legacy in the coming months. His legacy. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. That's when Sarah found the lawyer, Patricia Martinez, no relation, who specialized in institutional abuse cases. She was sharp, experienced, and refreshingly blunt about our chances. The statute of limitations ran out decades ago for criminal charges, she told us during our first meeting in her downtown Seattle office. But we can pursue civil action against the church for institutional negligence, for creating an environment where abuse could occur and failing to protect you. Civil action meant depositions, court filings, media attention. It meant having our names attached to this story forever, meant reliving our trauma in open court where defense attorneys would try to tear apart our credibility. They'll claim you're after money, Patricia warned us. They'll question your motives, your memories, your mental health. They'll hire experts to testify that childhood memories are unreliable, that you might have misinterpreted innocent mentoring as something more sinister. What about Thomas? Lisa asked. Can he be held accountable for what he did? Patricia's expression softened slightly. He's 84 now, in declining health. Even if we could prove individual liability, which would be difficult given the time that's passed, prosecuting an elderly man with dementia symptoms wouldn't be our strongest strategy. Dementia. The ultimate shield, Thomas's deteriorating mind would protect him from consequences just as his position of authority had protected him during the abuse itself. We filed the lawsuit anyway. Not for money, though the church's insurance company would eventually offer a settlement we'd have been fools to refuse. Not for revenge, though the satisfaction of seeing their lawyers scramble was considerable. We filed because silence had failed us, because institutional channels had failed us, because the only language these organizations seemed to understand was legal liability. The media coverage was immediate and brutal. Local church faces historic abuse claims, read the headline in the town newspaper. My mother called the morning the story broke, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. Are you proud of yourself? She asked. Destroying an old man's reputation, bringing shame on our entire community. Thomas is practically on his deathbed, Margaret. Couldn't you just let him die in peace? Peace. As if Thomas deserved the peace he'd stolen from us, as if his comfort mattered more than the truth we'd carried in silence for 30 years. He's not dying, I told her. He's just finally being held accountable. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Thomas Whitmore might never face criminal charges, might never spend a day in prison, might never even acknowledge what he'd done to us. Sometimes, I was learning, accountability looks different than justice. Sometimes survival is its own form of victory. The legal battle was just beginning, but for the first time in decades, we weren't fighting alone. The settlement check arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 5 years after we'd first contacted the church. $4 million, divided among the 4 of us and our legal team. It should have felt like victory. Instead, I stared at the numbers on the bank deposit slip and felt nothing but exhaustion. The money wasn't really the point, though it would pay for therapy we desperately needed and provide security we'd never had. The real victory was in the policy changes we'd forced: mandatory background checks for all youth leaders, never alone policies for private instruction, trauma-informed training for clergy and staff. Changes that might protect future children from what we'd endured. But victory, I was learning, could be its own kind of trauma. The media attention had been relentless. Local news stations camped outside our homes, reporters called at all hours wanting statements, comment sections filled with people debating whether we were brave survivors or vindictive liars. My name and face became synonymous with the case, my private pain transformed into public spectacle. Margaret Chen, now 58, was one of 4 women who came forward. The articles always began, reducing me to an age and a grievance, a statistic in a story about institutional failure. The community response split along predictable lines. Younger people, especially those with children, supported us vocally. They understood that protecting kids mattered more than protecting reputations. But many of the older congregation members, Thomas's contemporaries, treated us like we'd committed sacrilege. Mrs. Henderson, my old Sunday school teacher, crossed the street rather than speak to me when I visited my parents. The church secretary who'd known me since I was baptized sent a letter calling me an attention-seeking troublemaker. People who'd once praised my voice now whispered that I'd always been difficult, dramatic, unstable. The worst part was watching it tear my family apart. My father, caught between his loyalty to the church and his love for his daughter, developed stress-related heart problems that required surgery. He spent weeks in the hospital, monitors beeping around him while I sat by his bedside wondering if seeking justice had been worth potentially losing him. My mother aged a decade in those 5 years. The woman who'd once bragged about her daughter's musical gifts now avoided social gatherings, couldn't meet her neighbor's eyes at the grocery store. She never explicitly blamed me, but her silence spoke volumes. "I just wish you could have found another way," she said during one of our stilted phone conversations. Thomas is dead now. What was the point of all this pain? Thomas had died 18 months into our lawsuit, a heart attack in his sleep, peaceful and private, surrounded by family who still believed in his innocence. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd escaped earthly consequences, leaving us to fight his ghost and the institution that had enabled him. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners. Former students spoke about his mentorship, colleagues praised his dedication, family members wept for the gentle man they thought they knew. The 4 of us weren't welcome, of course. We watched from afar as the community celebrated the man who'd destroyed our childhoods. Sarah had a breakdown that day, sobbing in her car outside the funeral home while we took turns holding her. "He gets to be remembered as a saint," she whispered. "We get to be the villains who spoke ill of the dead." The legal victory hadn't changed that fundamental inequality. Thomas would be remembered by most people as a devoted choir director whose reputation was unfairly tarnished by vindictive women. We would be remembered as the troublemakers who brought scandal to a peaceful community. But there were unexpected gifts too. Women began reaching out, not just from our church, but from across the country. Teachers, coaches, pastors, family friends who'd crossed boundaries and traumatized children while hiding behind positions of trust. Our story had given them permission to tell theirs. The letters poured in by the hundreds. "Thank you for speaking up. You saved my daughter from a similar situation. I finally told my parents what happened to me 30 years ago." Each envelope contained someone else's pain, someone else's courage, someone else's journey from silence to voice. We'd started a support group that met monthly in Sarah's living room. What began as the 4 of us had grown to include dozens of survivors, some from our own case, others from different situations entirely. We shared resources, celebrated small victories, held each other through setbacks. "We're not victims anymore," Jennifer said during one of our meetings. "We're warriors. We fought back and we won." Won. The word still felt complicated to me. We'd received financial compensation and forced policy changes. We'd prevented Thomas from receiving the celebration he didn't deserve. We'd given other survivors permission to speak their truth. But we'd also lost family relationships, community connections, the simple peace of private lives. We'd traded our silence for public scrutiny, our secrets for front-page news. Some days the trade felt worth it. Other days I wondered if we'd simply exchanged one kind of suffering for another. My health had suffered too. The stress of 5 years of legal battles, media attention, and family tension had taken its toll. High blood pressure, chronic insomnia, an autoimmune condition that my doctors said was likely triggered by prolonged stress. My body was finally expressing the trauma I'd carried for so long. But I was alive. I was speaking. I was no longer the terrified 18-year-old who'd fled her hometown with secrets burning in her chest. The settlement money sat in my bank account, earning interest and waiting for me to decide what to do with it. Part of it would go to therapy, for me, for my parents, for the relationship we were slowly trying to rebuild. Part would fund the foundation we were creating to support other survivors of institutional abuse. And maybe, someday, when I was ready, part of it would help me find my voice again. Not the voice Thomas had stolen and twisted, but the one that belonged to me alone. Victory had come at a cost I was still calculating. But for the first time in 40 years, I could imagine a future where the hymns in my head might finally fall silent. Dr. Rachel Morrison was nothing like the therapists I'd tried before. No clinical distance, no gentle platitudes about time healing all wounds. She was a survivor herself, childhood abuse by a family friend, and she understood that trauma lived in the body as much as the mind. "We're going to work on reclaiming what was stolen from you," she told me during our first session in her sunny office overlooking Elliott Bay. "Not just your voice, but your relationship with music, with spirituality, with your own body." I was 66 when I finally found her, 5 years past the settlement, ready to do the deep work I'd been avoiding my entire adult life. The money from the lawsuit had given me the freedom to step back from my accounting practice, to focus on healing instead of just surviving. The therapy was unlike anything I'd experienced. Instead of just talking about trauma, we worked with it directly. Breath work that helped me reclaim my relationship with my own body. Movement therapy that taught me I could take up space without shame. Art therapy that let me express things I didn't have words for. But the hardest work was with music itself. "When did you stop singing?" Dr. Morrison asked during our 3rd month together. "The day I ran from that Easter service. I haven't sung a note since. Not even in the shower. Humming along to the radio." I shook my head. The very thought of opening my mouth to make music sent panic shooting through my chest. Thomas had poisoned that well so completely that even private, joyful singing felt like betrayal. "Music was your first language," she said gently. "Before words, before fear, before trauma, you communicated through song. We need to help you remember that it belongs to you, not to him." She started small. Having me listen to instrumental music, pieces with no vocals, no religious connections. Classical compositions that stirred something deep in my chest, jazz that made my feet tap against my will. Slowly, my body began to remember that music could exist without pain. Then came the breathing exercises, but these were different from what Thomas had used. These were about my breath, my rhythm, my choice. Dr. Morrison would play gentle melodies while I focused on breathing deeply, letting my chest expand and contract naturally, reclaiming the physical act Thomas had weaponized. "He took your breath away," she said during one session that left me sobbing. "Literally. He made you afraid to breathe deeply, to take up space, to let sound flow through you. We're taking that back." The first time I hummed, just a few notes of a melody I couldn't name, I cried for an hour. It felt like finding a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever, like discovering a room in my house I'd forgotten existed. Dr. Morrison introduced me to a music therapist named David Kim, a gentle man in his 50s who specialized in trauma recovery through sound. Our sessions took place in a room filled with instruments, drums, bells, a piano, even a small harp. "We're not here to perform," he assured me during our first meeting. "We're here to play. To remember that music can be joy, can be healing, can be yours again." I started with percussion, simple rhythms on drums that had no connection to my childhood trauma. The physical act of making sound with my hands felt revolutionary. Then came the bells, clear tones that seemed to cleanse the air around me. Eventually, David introduced humming exercises, my voice blending with the instruments in ways that felt safe and contained. The breakthrough came during a session 6 months into our work together. David was playing gentle chords on the piano, and without thinking, I began to hum along. Not a hymn, not anything from my past, but a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside me, something that was purely mine. When I realized what I was doing, I stopped abruptly, my hand flying to my throat. "It's okay," David said, continuing to play. "That was beautiful. That was your voice, not his. Can you try again?" I shook my head, but the melody was still there, waiting. It took 3 more sessions before I could let it out fully, but when I did, it felt like coming home to myself. Working with Dr. Morrison, I also began exploring my relationship with spirituality. The church had been so contaminated by trauma that I'd thrown away faith entirely, but she helped me separate the sacred from the institution that had failed me. "You can have a relationship with the divine that doesn't include him," she said. "You can reclaim prayer, meditation, even religious music if that's what you want. It's your choice." I wasn't ready for hymns yet, might never be. But I found peace in nature, in quiet moments of reflection, in the kind of spirituality that existed outside church walls and beyond the reach of men who used God's name to justify their cruelty. The support group I'd started with Sarah, Jennifer, and Lisa had evolved too. We met in a small community center now, our numbers grown to include 37 survivors from various situations. We called ourselves Voices Reclaimed, and our monthly meetings had become a lifeline for women learning to speak their truth. Some nights we just talked. Other nights we did breathing exercises together, or gentle movement, or simple vocal warm-ups for those ready to explore sound again. We celebrated small victories, a woman singing her child to sleep for the first time, another joining a church choir, someone writing a song about their journey. "Look how far we've come," Sarah said during one meeting, looking around the circle of women who'd found their courage. "Look how much healing is possible." At 71, I was finally learning that recovery wasn't about returning to who I was before Thomas. That girl was gone, and grieving her was part of the healing. Recovery was about becoming someone new, someone who carried the scars but wasn't defined by them. My voice was different now than it had been at 18. Deeper, rougher around the edges, marked by years of silence and pain. But it was mine. Fully, completely, undeniably mine. And slowly, note by note, breath by breath, I was learning to use it again. Standing in the doorway of St. Catherine's at 72, I feel like I'm completing a circle that began with my desperate flight at 18. But this time, I'm not running. This time, I'm walking towards something instead of away from it. The church has changed in the years since our lawsuit. New leadership, new policies, fresh paint that can't quite cover the institutional shame we forced them to confront. The old practice room where Thomas held his lessons has been converted into a children's library, its walls now lined with picture books instead of music awards. I've come here today for the dedication of our memorial garden, a small space behind the sanctuary where survivors can come to remember and heal. The plaques bear no names, just simple words, for the children whose voices were silenced. May they sing again. The current pastor, a young woman named Rebecca, greets me at the door. She wasn't here during Thomas's time, but she knows our story, has spent years trying to rebuild trust between the church and the community we helped educate. "Margaret," she says, taking my hands in hers. "Thank you for being here. This wouldn't exist without your courage." Courage. The word still feels foreign when applied to me, but I'm learning to accept it. What felt like survival at the time, speaking up, fighting back, refusing to stay silent, others call bravery. The dedication ceremony is small, intimate. About 50 people attend, some congregation members, several survivors from our support group, community advocates who've worked with us over the years. Sarah is here from California, Jennifer from Phoenix. Lisa couldn't make the trip, but she sent a letter that Rebecca reads aloud. Healing isn't about forgetting, Lisa's words ring through the sanctuary. It's about transforming pain into purpose, silence into song. This garden represents what we've all learned, that even in the darkest soil, new life can grow. After the ceremony, people gather in the social hall for coffee and quiet conversation. I find myself drawn back to the sanctuary, to the space where my voice was first noticed, then stolen, then finally, after so many years, reclaimed. The piano sits in the same spot it always has, though it's been replaced twice since my childhood. I approach it slowly, my fingers trembling as they touch the familiar keys. The muscle memory is still there, buried under decades of silence but not destroyed. I sit down on the bench and play a simple chord progression, nothing complicated, just the foundation for something larger. The sound echoes through the empty space, clean and clear and mine. Then, for the first time in 54 years, I open my mouth and sing in this sanctuary. Not a hymn, I'm not ready for that, may never be. Instead, I sing a song I wrote in therapy, a melody that emerged from months of careful healing work. The words are simple, born from my own journey. Asterisk, I was lost but I am finding. I was broken but I mend. I was silenced but I'm singing. My own song that has no end. Asterisk. My voice is different now than it was at 18. Weathered by years of smoking I took up in college, roughened by decades of unused silence, marked by age and pain and hard-won wisdom. But it's strong, and it's mine, and it carries truth that no one can take from me. As I sing, I hear footsteps in the aisle behind me. Sarah appears first, then Jennifer, then several other women from our support group. They don't join in, they don't know the words, but they stand witness to this moment, this reclamation. When the song ends, the silence that follows is different from the suffocating quiet I remember from my childhood. This silence is full, expectant, alive with possibility. That was beautiful, Sarah whispers, tears streaming down her face. That was you. Completely you. Later, driving home through Seattle's familiar streets, I think about the support group meeting we have scheduled for tomorrow night. 12 new women will be joining us, survivors of various forms of abuse who are just beginning their healing journeys. Some are recent victims, still raw with fresh trauma. Others, like I was, have carried their secrets for decades and are only now finding the courage to speak. I'll share my story with them, as I've done hundreds of times now. Not just the trauma, we all have enough pain, but the healing. The slow, difficult work of reclaiming what was stolen. The discovery that survival can become something more than just getting by. Most importantly, I'll tell them what I wish someone had told me at 18, that their voices matter, that their pain is real, that healing is possible even when it seems impossible. The foundation we created with our settlement money has grown beyond what any of us imagined. Voices Reclaimed now operates in 12 states, providing therapy resources, legal advocacy, and support groups for survivors of institutional abuse. We've helped pass legislation requiring trauma-informed training for youth leaders, strengthened reporting requirements, and created safe spaces for healing. But the real victory isn't in the policies or the programs. It's in the voices, hundreds of them now, learning to sing again. Tomorrow night, I'll sit in our circle and watch new survivors take their first tentative steps toward healing. I'll see the fear in their eyes that I remember so well, but also something else, hope. And maybe, if the moment feels right, I'll sing my song for them. Not to perform or impress, but to show them what's possible. To prove that even voices that have been silenced for decades can learn to make music again. The hymns Thomas whispered while he hurt me will always be part of my story. But they're not the end of it. Now I have new songs, songs of survival, of healing, of hope. Songs that belong only to me, that no one can twist or steal or use against me. At 72, I'm finally singing my own song. And it's just the beginning.